Radical responsibility, extreme ownership. These are mindsets that we have talked about previously on the Coaching Culture podcast. And I fully believe that exceptional leaders, they operate from these mindsets. Except when we take these mindsets too far, when we fail to challenge and empower others to take responsibility and ownership themselves, well, then extreme ownership can turn to self-blame, and it can start to shatter our confidence as a leader. It also can save people from taking responsibility for their actions, their performance. So today, we unpack this leadership polarity of both taking responsibility and empowering others to take responsibility for themselves, for the team's culture, for their performance, and their experience. Welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast, where we are dedicated to helping you unlock your leadership potential and create winning team environments. My name is JP Nerbun, and I'm joined by my co-hosts, Betsy Butterick and Nate Sanderson. Each week, we bring you practical tips and strategies to elevate your coaching. For more, you can learn about our work, explore online courses and books at tocculture.com and betsybutterick.com. You can also subscribe to our weekly newsletter at tocculture.com for weekly culture building insights and the notes to this in every episode of the podcast. All right. The gang is back together again. Welcome back, Nate. We got Nate, Betsy, and myself here. And at the time of recording, it's kind of the end of basketball, wrestling, and ice hockey season here. And a lot of coaches are going into reflection mode. They're looking back on their year. Maybe they're doing exit interviews with players. And, I know many of our listeners would be asking this question of just what can I be better at next year? When I look at the things that didn't turn out the way I wanted them, we moved to this place of, well, we try to take ownership, right? Extreme ownership of the culture that we've created, the relationships that we've built with our athletes, or maybe failed to build, or the culture that we failed to create that we wanted. Recently, I had a call with a coach there who was going down this path, and he's going down hard. He was looking at a few of the relationships with some parents of some seniors in his program, and those seniors also weren't bought into the culture that he had been created, and he was being really hard on himself. And he said the question he's asking himself most right now is, how can he make sure that this situation never happens again? This situation where parents weren't bought in and were critical of him and the team. And I said, well, there's only one way you can do that. And that's just to never coach again, right? Like at the end of the day, like there are certain things that are going to be outside of your control. And this is a tough thing to navigate. That's what we want to talk about today, which is just this really challenging balance between taking ownership and responsibility of what we have done as a leader, our effect. And when we look at other aspects of our program, whether it's relationships with players or players being self-reflective on what they can do to improve their game, whatever it be, and them not taking ownership, them not taking responsibility for what part they have played in the culture, in the relationship, in the lack of execution on game day, whatever it be. And so how do we navigate this as a coach where it doesn't take us down this spiral of just being really self-deprecating? And I think that's the question we're going to wrestle with today. So I'm going to throw this to you, Betsy and Nate, which is, where do you see this in your own coaching or the people that you work with in your conversations with coaches? Where are you seeing this show up for them?
I see this often in conversations, whether it's workshops or with individual clients, when we talk about having difficult conversations or confrontation and doing all the work before the conversation in preparation to have that conversation go well. And the question inevitably comes up of, okay, Betsy, but what if I do all of this and they don't want to have the conversation? Or, I can be really skilled. What if they're not? And it just blows up. And so I think this is a great topic to discuss, because it begs the question, what's mine? What's my responsibility? What's our shared responsibility? And how do I operate in a space where, despite my intentions and despite all the work that I've put in to make this thing happen, to create the possibility, someone's not wanting or willing to dance with me? So I'm excited that we're talking about this today.
Yeah, JP, I think for me, this, I think it manifests in a lot of subtle and different ways for coaches. I think anytime there's a rejection, from a player or from a parent or from an assistant coach. And that's not necessarily like, look, I don't want to coach with you anymore, so I'm leaving, kind of an abrupt sort of rejection, as much as it's like, oh, I scheduled a workout and only 2 kids come in and nobody let me know why they weren't there. And so in the mystery of like, I know they're not here, but I don't know why. Is that my fault? Am I doing this wrong? Like, there's a tendency there, as you said before, like we want to, on the one hand, take extreme ownership and say, okay, everything that happens in this program is my responsibility. It may not be my fault, but it's my responsibility. But we have to have some guardrails there so that we don't end up in a place where everything that goes wrong, we turn and start to beat ourselves up over, I should have known that. Why did I make that play call? This kid I should have communicated differently with. And now all of a sudden, we become our own worst critic, perhaps because, we don't necessarily have great strategies internally to handle some of that, whether it's uncertainty or when things don't go right or when others don't reciprocate. It could be our commitment. It could be our dedication. It could be the amount of time that we're putting in. And that can be hard. That can be really difficult. I think, especially for transformational coaches, when, we are driven to make a difference. And sometimes, if we're being fully honest, you go through seasons and you think, how much did I really matter this year outside of the game? And then where do you go when you start down that rabbit hole? So I think this is great. I think it's timely for coaches, as you mentioned, as kind of being in a reflective season for those of us that are coming out of a winter sport.
Yeah, I mean, other areas I see it come up too, that building off what you guys all just shared there, which was just game plan, right? A coach has a certain game plan, and players are going, "Oh, I don't buy into that." Like they had some other coach and he ran a different type of game plan, or she ran a different game plan, and so they become resistant for whatever reason. When we start to go, do they not trust me? Do they not trust my expertise? Right? Um, Playing time decisions. That's a big one, right? You make a playing time decision, and back to the conversation thing, Betsy, you said, which is you try to be really intentional. You try to value this player outside of their how much points they score, their playing time. You feel like you're doing everything, and they're still really upset. And it's really difficult. So I think we see two pendulum swings. One is where it becomes a place where we say, that's my fault. I didn't do it good enough. And, we feel bad. We feel like if they're not happy, we can't be happy. The other end of the spectrum is we just go into a total defensive state, right? We go into a like, kids these days are entitled, or, and we stop taking responsibility for what, we could do better in those situations. So, I think there's a bit of internal work here, as you kind of mentioned there, Nate. There's a bit of external work, right? I don't know, Betsy, if you could kind of describe or maybe help us illustrate what is the differences between, that external work, internal work, and in relation to this topic.
Yeah, a few things come up for me, and this is all the examples you just gave. And as you were talking, JP, I was thinking of another one that I see often from coaches: that frustration around, if this athlete only did these things, then they could achieve the potential that I see in them. And there's so much frustration around, I create all these opportunities, I'm willing to put in the work, or I am putting in the work, and they're not meeting me there. And gosh, if they only did this, then we could, they could achieve something different. When you talk about the internal work, listening to the language that we're all using, a couple things come up for me. One is this idea of controllables and uncontrollables. So what is mine to do? What do I control? What do I not control? And on this topic specifically, and I find myself saying this often, the only thing that we really control is the invitation. We get to craft the invitation, whether it's to invite a player to do extra work, whether it's to, create an opportunity for somebody to engage in something. We are in charge of creating the invitation. Where some of the personal work comes in is, okay, so we extend an invitation and let's say it's rejected or just, not responded to. We get nothing back. What do we do then? Can we recraft the invitation to make it more desirable? Are we creating judgment when our invitation is declined? What are we making it mean that someone didn't accept? Are we making it personal? Are we making it about them? You mentioned that defensiveness, JP. So I think the starting point, as is with many things, is awareness. When we have an opportunity or we've created and extended an invitation and it's declined or rejected, what comes up next for people? Starting to generate that awareness of, how do I feel? What are the immediate responses that I have? Is it defensiveness? Is it self-deprecation? Where does my mind go in those situations? That's a starting point for doing some of the internal work that can really help us be a little more stable and not have our happiness, our well-being tied to choices of others that are outside of our control.
Yeah, and what you're talking about there is that external work is how do we improve the invitation? How do we improve what we're doing within that relationship or within a culture? And the internal work is all about, navigating that blame or self-blame or self-criticism. And one thing that came up for me was a responsibility to these athletes, not a responsibility for their happiness, not a responsibility for them. Nate, I'm really curious, to come back to you on this, which is this being really difficult when you think about that, especially as someone that's such a transformational coach, and it feeling like they're rejecting when it's not being reciprocated, this invitation into relationship, this invitation to a commitment to work towards a goal of something that's, whether it's a great team culture or even just a championship. What's the hardest part about that for you as a coach?
Well, I think there's layers to that. You mentioned a coach's confidence earlier, and I think that there's always a piece of us that when we try something and it doesn't work or it doesn't play out the way that we thought that it would, that we begin to, potentially doubt our ability to make the next decision, right? So in a straight sports context, that could be some kind of strategic decision during a game. It doesn't work out. We go back and we think, man, do I really know what I'm doing here? And then maybe the next time we have to make a decision, we're just not as sure of ourselves, maybe. And that probably affects, it can affect how we communicate that decision and, all kinds of things, right? But I think that can be applied to even, striving for a purposeful, meaningful impact on the lives of kids. If you go through a season and, there are some years you get the thank you cards at the end after the graduation party that says, Coach, thanks for teaching me this and, having a great experience, whatever. And sometimes you don't get those. And when you don't, you start to wonder, well, was I as effective this year? Did I do something different? Did I mess up a relationship here that I wasn't aware of? I think there's just that tendency to look inward, and you use the word blame. I would default to blaming myself when those things don't work out. And I think there is a degree to that is healthy, obviously, to reflect both to, as Betsy said, have an awareness of how am I feeling in the moment of, not getting those letters or whatever it might be. But if that's taken too far, that can become detrimental, I think, to a coach's confidence. If it seeps into the foundation of how we think about ourselves, we're likely to be less effective if we allow that to happen.
And what you're saying, Nate, what comes up for me is expectation, right? And that's another awareness question is what is my expectation when I extend this invitation? What is my expectation when I create this opportunity? And I think to a conversation I had with Sue Enquist years and years ago, and she was at UCLA at the same time as Coach Wooden. She called him Papa. And he said to her at one point, you can't pass a moral judgment on them being the players, if they don't love it like you do. And I think a lot of times, even subconsciously, we have an expectation or we hold an expectation that if we do this thing, there will be a certain or specific response. So asking yourself for the internal work, what is my expectation? Do I have an expectation, even if it's unspoken, especially if it's unspoken, for a certain type of response when I do this thing? And what's that about? And the external work for me in that vein would be when I have an expectation that's not met, to get as much information as possible about why that expectation wasn't either desirable or helpful or something that was interesting to the other person or to the team. So I create an opportunity for people to come in for open gym and nobody shows. And I'm like, and I start, having all these frustrations about they're not willing to put in the time and the effort and the work, and they're only doing the basics, the bare minimum. To ask, hey, can I ask why you didn't come to open gym today? Oh, well, I use that time to study. Can I ask why you didn't come to open gym today? Honestly, it helps me to have a day off more than it does to get back in the gym at this point in the season. Just getting information so that then we can go back and recraft an invitation or throw it away, like change the party. We talk about it takes two to tango, and maybe there's a different dance that we can do that would engage more people. I think about line dancing, right? So we've gone from 2 people to however many people want to show up and partake. So what are the ways that we can be responsive and intentional and gather information so that we create new and different opportunities that might be more engaging?
Yeah, I'm really interested on that actually. You know, let's say you get more information or you can't get more, let's say you can't get more information, right? Or even the information you get, the answers you get aren't really to your liking. You don't necessarily trust that they're true, they're fully transparent, maybe they're uncomfortable. We get that sense. I think, there's two things that you shared, Nate, that like there's a lack of it affects the confidence of a coach, but there's also just this deeper purpose. Like we want to have relationships, we want to have impact on everyone's lives. And so when we get to the end of the year and we're going, geez, there's a handful of players here, and I'm not sure that they liked me, that they there's a relationship there, that they felt like they're better off for having played for me. There's something difficult when you think about that, and there's that, like Betsy said, there's an expectation that, well, if I'm doing my job right, I should be having an impact on everybody. I'm wondering, like, what's the hardest part for coaches in that space of not having an impact on every athlete? Like when you look at your own experience, or maybe talking to other coaches, like what's the hardest part or the worst part about not having this impact across the board?
Yeah, this comes up even in the workshops that I do in facilitation, to remember my purpose. So, my purpose is to extend an invitation. My purpose is to be of service. My purpose is to give an audience tools or strategies or frameworks that may be helpful given what they experience in life. And I often think about that parable of the starfish, where there's a kid on the beach and there's all these starfish, hundreds that are washed up on the floor or on the beach. And the kid's picking them up and one by one throwing them back in the ocean. And the guy walking by stops and he asks the kid, he's like, "What are you doing?" He's like, "You can't save them all." And the kid picks up one and he throws it in the ocean. He says, "I made a difference to that one." And so, can we hold it lightly? And I realize that may be a big challenge when you have chosen the coaching profession and you have this purpose of making an impact on the young people that you coach. Can you hold that lightly? Can you show up with intention and purpose and also hold lightly the fact that you may not be for everyone, that everything that you know is good and beneficial may not be received or desired? So can you hold it lightly and balance this responsibility, this purpose, this intention with the response that you do or don't get, with the engagement that you do or don't get? I think that's the hardest thing, is when we feel like, "Oh, I'm doing all that I can to make a difference." You're not going to save all the starfish, but can you make a difference to one? And is that enough for you in what you do? Does that have meaning? Does that have value? And to reflect on those things.
And Nate, for you, like, what's the hardest part about that? Like being able to navigate that aspect of what Betsy just shared there.
Well, I think JP, I think a couple of things. Number one, why is it difficult is because when you make a conscious decision to be a transformational coach and do it differently, and you put yourself out there, with your program or with your parent community or administrators, and you say, look, we are going to try to use sport to grow kids. We're going to try to win games, but that is secondary to using sport to grow the character of the kids in our program. That's like the definition, of who I want to be in that moment. That's a lot deeper and that's a lot more personal than saying, we're going to go out and try to win the conference this year, kids. Like that isn't necessarily a reflection on me, because or as vulnerable, because I'm not setting myself apart for something that is countercultural at the same time, if that makes sense. So I think there's just this depth to that where it isn't just a strategy. It isn't just we're chasing a goal this year. This is how I identify and see myself, my own sense of identification. And therefore, I draw my worth from that. I draw my confidence from that. I draw my purpose from that. And so then when it feels like at the end of the year that maybe we didn't have the impact that we wanted, it hits differently than just not winning the league.
Yeah, that's really powerful, the way that you shared that. And the word that just keeps coming up for me is love, right? We are, I mean, and maybe it's not a word that's used enough in sports, but we're trying to be out there and loving people, loving these athletes, loving these coaches, loving our community, loving, right? Like there's love in all of this, and there's risk in all that. though. There's like this inherent risk that we could go out, we put ourselves out there, and that would feel deeply personal when someone says, "Nah, I don't want that love." Like, it's. I mean, we've heard it over the years. There's people that come in. It's just like, no, just coach. Stop trying to build a relationship. All right, stop trying to, you know, work on character. Right, like we've had coaches that have had that experience from parents, from athletes, from administrations that were like, no, 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 we don't want that. Just go win games. And so to have that from an administration, to have that from a community to reject that, or to have that just from a one individual where you see potential in them, yeah, that's a heavy thing, especially when you're working like heck to make that invitation great, like, and to make that appealing.
And I think JP, what's helped me in that, is just talking with a few other coaches and being coached on this a little bit. Two things. Number one, like, we tend to think of our impact, if we're going to kind of stay in this lane here, we measure it in ways that we've measured it before. So in other words, like for me, when I think back to my experience at Springville, small town, small community, major impact on a small number of people, great deep relationships, across the board. Like, Mount Vernon is a different place. A big school is a different place. And it doesn't mean that I'm not being impactful. It doesn't mean that we're not having influence, but that influence might manifest differently, if that makes sense, because of just the context of the entire school and community and program is different. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just recognizing, like, I can't always use the same lens of what we had 10 years ago or at a previous stop to evaluate, am I being effective here? And that's been a bit of a paradigm shift for me, I think, over the last, I don't know, couple of months as I've kind of thought about this. I think the other thing, and you've alluded to this, but this analogy I think makes sense to me, is in so many ways, TJ Rosine talks all the time about how as coaches, we are sowers. We don't often see the fullness or the full ripening of the fruit for the seeds that we cast in the lives of kids, right? And so, there is some truth to that parable of the sower, in the Bible, where the farmer's job, the sower's job is to cast the seed. But sometimes it's going to fall on the path or the rocky soil, or it's going to be choked out by the weeds. And that is outside of our purview. Like, I can't control that, right? When it falls in that fertile soil and it starts to take root and it starts to bear fruit, again, we respond to that differently, rather than looking at, my job is to sow as many seeds as possible and hope that someday, whether I see the fruit of that or not, my impact goes on in this kid's life. But there are times where those seeds are not going to take root for whatever reason, and that's not necessarily our fault.
You talk about our job, Nate, and even the transition, it's different at Mount Vernon. It's different at a bigger school. And for me, a lot of this comes back to, a question we commonly ask kids is, what do you want to be when you grow up? And a better question is, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I think that's a challenge for a lot of coaches, is their identity is directly, inextricably tied to what they do. So you might do things differently at a big school or a small school, but who you are, how you're being, that can stay the same, or it can, adapt based on the circumstances. But I think that when we're talking about this idea of the internal work, the external work, for me, some of it is separating out that identity of, who do I want to be? And then what do I want to do that reinforces or is sourced from my way of being? Because when they're one and the same, that's when it becomes really hard, when we go through, like you said, the natural ups and downs of, this seed germinated, this seed didn't, for very valid reasons that are okay. But it doesn't feel okay when my sense of self-worth, when my confidence, when my happiness is tied to all of those seeds germinating because I sowed them and I did the best thing, I did the right thing. So it's like, okay, cool. Who do you want to be? And then what do you want to do based off of who you take yourself to be?
This is, yeah, fantastic. And it makes me think about, I mean, Joe Ehrman talks about this, the Messiah complex, right? And this is a trap, I think, transformational coaches, your identity sometimes is in the transactional, is it's tied up to the wins and losses. and the transformational coach, the identity can come up into just the lives that you're changing and the impact, right? It's a good thing, but it's not who you are. It's still what you do. You're just coaching a sport, and yeah, you have a altruistic motives. There's a great purpose in that, but it's not necessarily who you are. And so I just think that's a great awareness point out by you, Betsy. I think also too of just like how do we continue to take 100% responsibility without falling into self blame, self criticism. My key in this is that we just stay curious. We stay curious. I think it can be very easy to go into the defense, and it's we've got to be constantly asking, hey, what is this situation teaching me about my players? What is it teaching me about my circumstances? But also, what might it be teaching me about myself? Right? What am I subject to? Right? We're very quick to be able to point out what other people are subject to, their entitlement, their lack of gratitude, but what beliefs might I be subject to in this? And this is where I think navigating the situation by ourselves is very difficult, which is the benefit of mentors and coaches and external people that can speak truth into our lives or help us to hold up a mirror so that we can look at self-reflect. Like there's so much in that. We have to stay curious around not just what am I learning about my situation or others, but what can I learn about myself in this? And you're staying curious. That's taking responsibility. It's not saying I'm a bad coach. It's not saying I'm a failure. It's not saying you're to blame in this situation. It's just what can I learn in this situation? I think that's a really, really important thing that coaches should try to is remain curious.
I think one of the things that's helped me a little bit in that, JP, and this goes back to our conversation with Annie Duke a while back and her book, Thinking in Bets, is that when I think about a decision, we'll use just in a sports context, for example, we make a decision to employ a particular strategy and, maybe that strategy doesn't work out. And so when I go back and look at the decision, it isn't necessarily that, oh, I don't know what I'm doing or that was a poor decision. I think the encouragement in her book was there information that you were missing when the decision was made? And so going back and looking like, well, did we miss something in another film? Did we miss something in the stats that might have helped us, defend in a different way? And how could I have had that information, or how can I have that information next time when I'm presented with a similar situation? So that in some ways insulates me a little bit. It's not necessarily about me being a failure or incapable or what have you. It's really about, okay, do our surveillance systems need to be better? Does our information path need to be better in some way so that we can make a more informed decision next time? And I think you can apply that to some of our cultural decisions too, when things work out or don't work out. A simple example would be, we did a longer practice on one of the days during the state tournament, thinking that the next day would be really light and then we would play after that. And so we go through this practice and it's not real energetic and I'm dragging, right? Because we just played the day before. And so, coming out of that, I'm just reflecting and talking to our captains a little bit. And it's like, I should have recognized that everybody was tired, myself included, my staff included, and been more responsive to that. How did I miss it? Well, I was just zoned in on next opponent, next set of film, next scout, and really didn't take the time to think about, but where are we at? So that makes me better next time, right? When I'm planning in a postseason situation, like I have to make sure I'm asking that question of our team. Where are we at? What do we have for a capacity for practice tonight or absorb in film and what have you? And to be honest with you, later in the week, we just canceled a film session because I recognized we were tired. And it was the best thing that we could have done, right? So I think that kind of reflection makes it a little more sterile and a little bit less personal.
Yeah, and that less personal part, Nate, I'm glad you brought that up. For me, this goes to priorities as well. Like as a coach, my priorities are likely different than those of my athletes, especially out of season. I know a lot of coaches right now are transitioning out of their winter sports. So let's say, I'm going back to that open gym example. It's like my priority is to schedule opportunities for us to continue to work on our game and develop in the off season so that we're better next season. my athletes' priorities might be wildly different. Like, oh, I'm going to prioritize spending time with my boyfriend or girlfriend because we're finally out of season and it was a long season and I haven't put time in there. So even having a conversation about priorities can be helpful. I think back to I was an intern at Stanford. This is my first job, after playing intern at Stanford for Tara Vanderveer. And our coach planning sessions for practice were always about an hour, 2 hours long. And I sat there one morning and she said, Betsy, can you go down to the court early? And I want you to tape 3-point lines on the side baskets because we're going to do this shooting drill. And I was like, yeah. So using a string and, going out and marking the circumference on 6 side baskets and then putting tape down. Tape is not curved. So you have to make these little pieces to make this perfect 3-point line. And so I did that. And then we come down for practice at 1. And Tara's there about 20 minutes before, and she said, Betsy, you can go ahead and take up the tape. Like, we're not going to do that drill anymore. And I had to tell myself, like, close your mouth, like, like don't show the disappointment because I put in so much work. It took so much time to tape down those 3-point lines, but the priority had shifted. She got intel about who was and wasn't going to be there that day. That shooting drill was no longer the most effective use of her team's time. And that's one thing I truly appreciated about Tara as a coach is, yes, she's a great basketball mind, the X's and O's, but she's constantly aware of what's the priority right now. And how do I create the conditions to allow us to prioritize what's essential and what's not? And so that was a foundational great lesson, as frustrating as it was at the time, of holding things lightly and addressing the immediate needs despite the amount of effort and work and intention and care that you've put into things that the priorities have changed. And is that okay? Like, what's my ability to let that go and to recognize, yeah, it's not that you didn't do a good job. It's not that, I don't appreciate your effort. It's that the priorities are different right now. And so we're going to focus on that.
Well, as we kind of wrap this up here today, one of the phrases that came out of our kind of preparation, pre-interview conversation here off air was, what are we making this mean? And I think when we identify whether it's we perceive a rejection or we try something that didn't work, or we thought we communicated and we apparently didn't, based on the response of our players or our coaches or what have you, in that space, as we're trying to tell ourselves a story and interpret, the meaning behind it, I think we have to be really conscious of that. And I think, for me personally, that means starting from a place of grace. Can I tell myself a story that gives me the benefit of the doubt, that is consistent with the information that I know to be true? And oftentimes what's so hard about that place is we have incomplete information, whether it's players that don't show up for a workout and you don't know why, and you have to figure out a story rather than that being your fault. There could be lots of reasons why, but just being aware of the explanation and asking ourselves, okay, does that match all the data that I know to be true? What do I not know about this situation? And then pausing and just sort of allowing some space there before maybe we can gather more information from players or what have you, I think is really important, because we have a tendency, and I think Betsy used this phrase in our conversation, where the first explanation tends to be the shitty first draft. And usually we're the villain in that first story. And I don't know that that's always fair to ourselves. But if we're not careful and not aware of the stories and the meaning that we're assigning, we can get ourselves in a spiral that's really unhealthy and really unproductive.
Yeah, that shitty first draft is something that I've heard Brene Brown say, that in that story I'm telling myself. And oftentimes the story that we're telling, that first draft is really bad. Um, Doubling down on Brene, I think about it takes two to tango, and it does, but it first requires getting on the dance floor, because you could, easily stand against the wall or hang out at the bar or, not be on the dance floor. So anytime we're going to do something that's meaningful, it involves vulnerability. And Brene defines vulnerability as, involving uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And all of those things are things that coaches deeply feel in the work that we get to do. So first, congratulate yourself for getting on the dance floor. And then it's just about finding the right partner. And some people, may have a hurt ankle and they'd love to dance with you, but they just can't right now. Or, there's reasons why people may decline your invitation. You're still on the dance floor. Somebody will dance. And if you can just be consistent in in allowing yourself to continue to be vulnerable, even when it hurts a little bit, or ooh, like our immediate reaction is often to close down when we put ourselves out there and then it didn't go well. What if instead, in those moments where we feel the urge to close down, we opened up even more? Yeah, that sounds terrifying. And sometimes that's the space that we can control to create opportunities that didn't exist before. So I'm excited for people to reflect on what we've talked about today and also see what comes up for them moving forward.
Yeah, and you think about moving forward, here'd be my question for all the listeners that maybe resonate with this struggle. I think we all do in some aspect of our life, whether it's coaching our athletes, whether it's our experience as a parent, or in a relationship with a partner, right? Of, when maybe not feeling the level of commitment to that relationship on the other side, um, that's difficult. And my question is, to all listeners, can you become a coach whose happiness, fulfillment isn't dependent upon others, right? Others' happiness, their joy, right? I think so much of us as transformational coaches, we those highs and lows, right? There's those great seasons where we're just feeling everyone's connected, you know, and we're having an impact and the feedback's great and everyone loves us. And there's next years where we got, a group of seniors or a group of athletes there that are the disgruntled's, and that just absolutely wrecks us. It becomes this horrible season. Can you imagine yourself being okay with that? And maybe you're fine with the highs and lows of it, and that's just going to come with it. And that's okay. I will say I know, and I've worked with some coaches that have been able to make that shift. They've been able to make that shift. And it's been a lot of internal work. So I don't want to make it simple, but this would be maybe 3 suggestions that I would offer, right? Because it's a lot more complicated than what I'm about to just share, because there's so much internal work there and our own stuff that we've got to work through. But start from a place of just allowing people to feel. When you bench the player, it's okay that they're upset. They should be allowed to feel upset, right? No matter how well you communicate that, right? It's okay that a player doesn't like you. They're allowed to not like you, right? You might have done everything you can for them to appreciate you and have that relationship and that connection, but they don't want it. That's okay. That's their choice. And we need to drop that expectation of they should, you know, be this committed. They should, value these types of things. And that's just dropping that. And the next thing is just to set a boundary, right? And I think that's so important, is that we just set a boundary of and when we set a boundary, Dr. Becky says this, Dr. Becky Kennedy, a boundary is saying what we will not do, right? And so we're setting a boundary here is saying, hey, if you're going to have that type of attitude, I will not allow you to be a part of our practice today, right? That's setting a boundary. A boundary is also saying, if you're going to have, you can choose to be unhappy, but I'm not going to let that affect my happiness, right? It's choosing to move forward this. And I think back to my mother, who is just an amazing woman. She has this phrase that she's used with all 7 of us, of her kids, which is, you're going to have a great time. And if you don't, it's your own fault, right? You're going to have a great time. If you don't, it's your own fault. And she'd say that every year when we'd go off to the beach for our 1-week beach vacation. And it might sound cruel and harsh and, not empathetic, but trust me, my mother was not just sitting back and relaxing. She worked her butt off to plan the best week's vacation that she could with the budget that we lived off of. And she cooked all these meals, and there was games and there was activities and there was events. And at the end of the day, she also said, I'm doing everything I can, but I have 7 kids and some of them are just not going to be happy. And that's not my fault. That's their fault. And so she set a boundary while also taking 100% responsibility for creating the conditions in her family for us all to have a great time. And I think that's us for us coaches. Every year we do everything we can. We try to get everything right. And sometimes some people just aren't going to be happy in our program. And that's okay. At the end of the day, that was their choice, not our choice. So make that separation. All right, that wraps up this episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with other leaders. For online courses and more, go to tocculture.com. And don't forget to subscribe to our weekly newsletter at tocculture.com for episode notes and resources. And thank you for listening in.